Hey everybody, welcome to what should be the first episode in a 10-part series. If you're going to watch it in any kind of order, you should watch this one first. The series is called Exposing Hoaxes, Busting Myths, and Solving Mysteries, a 10-part lecture series in archaeology. This was inspired by Dr. Holly Norton, who's an archaeologist at the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation in Colorado. And Holly and I are Facebook friends. She suggested that maybe we could work together on this series. The series is going to focus on myths, hoaxes, and mysteries in archaeology. And I hope you find them all enjoyable. Now, you want to know who I am. Right? My name is Ken Fader, and I am an archaeologist. I'm wearing this shirt, in fact, for a specific reason. A lot of folks think that archaeology is about digging up dinosaurs. It's not. Dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago. The oldest evidence for upright walking human ancestors maybe is like 7 million years. No matter how much I try, though, I can't convince people that I don't dig up dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs. It's what got me interested in the past when I was a little kid. We had a carpenter on campus taught for more than 40 years at Central Connecticut State University here in New Britain, Connecticut. We had a carpenter who was working on some shelving in my lab, and we would chat. He was a really nice guy, smart guy, and he was really interested in my work, and I talked about the archaeology that I did. For years after that on campus, when he would see me, he would say, "Hey, Dr. Fader, how's the dinosaur business?" And it got to the point where I just said, "Yeah, dinosaur business is it's doing great. It's doing really well." We don't dig up dinosaurs. We dig up human remains, the things that people made and used. That's what archaeology is all about. Now that's me on the left of the slide at an archaeological site. I, for 40 plus years, was a field archaeologist. I spent a lot of time excavating. When people talk to me and accuse me of being an armchair scientist, man, you don't get a bad back, bad knees, and a crushed ankle by falling out of your armchair. It's from doing archaeology for 40 years. I'm also an author, so I've got a bunch of books. I will shamelessly flog the books during the course of this 10-part series. And if you like the series, if you like the way I communicate, then check out my books. I call myself your friendly neighborhood archaeologist, and I don't even know why. I figured I needed a catchphrase, and I sort of panicked about coming up with one. So that's the one I came up with. If you think that's really dumb, I agree with you. But you'll see me introducing myself as your friendly neighborhood archaeologist in a bunch of these. Here's my shameless self-promotion. This book, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology, now in its 10th edition, going into its 11th edition, sort of is the core of this lecture series, because that book is all about frauds, myths, and mysteries. It's something that the first edition of it was published in 1990. We'll talk more about that later on. My favorite review, absolutely favorite review of this book, came from an anonymous colleague who described it like this: Fader's book is filled with humor. It's like giving your dog a pill wrapped in cheese. I mean, the point he's making here is that in a lot of cases, I disabuse people of things they really wish were true, like ancient aliens, or Atlantis, or Bigfoot, and so on and so forth, but I do it in a humorous way. Now, I will admit something to you. Every once in a while, people will say to me, "Fader, you're really mean." And I honestly don't intend to be mean. Snarky, maybe, that's, one of the more charming aspects of my personality. Snarky. In fact, I'm the snarky archaeologist. I wish I could be the snarkyologist, but that Dr. Norton I mentioned previously, she already stole that. Well, she took it. I'd like to steal it from her. So we'll let her be the snarkyologist, and I'll just be the snarky archaeologist, I guess. But I don't intend to be mean. I don't intend to be brutal to anybody. I'm just somebody who's really passionate about the human past, and when somebody says something who's not trained, who has no experience in archaeology, whose background in archaeology is basically, well, I did my own research, I watched a TikTok video. Folks, that's not enough. Expertise mounts to something, it counts for something. That doesn't mean I'm always right. Absolutely not. But it means I have the training, I have the background, I've done the reading, so that I know what works and what doesn't work. And so that counts for something. And as I, again, debunk or disabuse folks of biblical giants and ancient aliens and Atlantean seafarers and ancient monks in New Hampshire sacrificing people and lost tribes of Israel in New Mexico writing the Ten Commandments, these are all things that I'll talk about during the series. I come from a perspective of an archaeologist, somebody who has excavated sites and knows what to find, knows what will be found, knows what to look for anyway, when doing archaeology. So that's me. Now, what archaeology is really, how do we know anything? Whether we're talking about ancient Atlantis or ancient aliens or ancient monks in New Hampshire, how do we know? How do we know if a hypothesis, if a claim, or if a speculation has any data to back it up? Now, what I always told my classes was that archaeology is sort of kind of similar to detective work. You know how the old cliche, detectives investigate the scene of a crime. Well, archaeologists investigate the scene of a life, but both detectives and archaeologists collect material evidence. They go to a place, they dig stuff up, they find stuff. They look for material evidence of what happened. Now, for a detective, it may be what happened yesterday involving a crime, and for an archaeologist, it may mean what happened 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or 100,000 or 1,000,000 years ago, and not just a crime, but a life. People eating and drinking and raising their kids and making tools and hunting and gathering. How did they live? Well, we find that out by digging up the material evidence they left behind. The best example I can give you, the best metaphorical archaeologist here is this guy, Sherlock Holmes. Now, I admit it, man, I'm growing up in New York. There were 3 television stations, independent stations. These are local. They didn't have a lot of their own programming, so to save money, they showed a lot of old movies. And the 14 movies made between 1939 and 1946 with Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, I was transfixed by those, especially Hound of the Baskervilles. That inspired me in the 1990s to watch the series produced by Granada TV in the UK, which was far truer to the actual canon, the stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. They did about 40 out of the 50, well, there are 60 stories altogether. They did about 40, 41, 42, depending on how you count them. And they were great. They were fantastic. And that inspired me to read all the stories and read the books. 56 short stories, 4 novels. And I've read them multiple times. So I'm kind of obsessed. If there's a 10-step program to walk me away from Sherlock Holmes, I don't want it. I don't want it. I want to be obsessed by Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective, and in many ways acts the way an archaeologist would act. So in investigating a mound of cigar ash and the footprint of a giant hound, in looking at 3 wine glasses that criminals drank from, but finding residue in only one of those glasses, in investigating the scene of what appears to be a murder, made all the more mysterious by the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Holmes solves the crimes presented in those 56 short stories in those 4 novels. Now, the last one of those, the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, is a story about a missing racehorse and the death of the racehorse's trainer. The story is called The Adventure of Silver Blaze. Now, that's not a horse. That's my cat, Olive, who I promised I would work into the series. And, you got to keep promises to your cats. My family calls her Olive. I call her Silver Blaze because look at that blaze, that white or silver line down her nose. That's why the horse in the story is called Silver Blaze, and that actually becomes an important plot point in the story later on. No, no spoilers here. Read the story. It's a really good story, and Granada did a great production of The Adventure of Silver Blaze. Now here's the deal. Holmes is invited to investigate the scene of the assumed murder when the inspector, the cops, they can't find anything. And these are screen grabs from the Granada series where Holmes is actually on his hands and knees, on his belly, and he is excavating through the mud looking for something. And you notice in the screen on the right, he's found something. Now, the actual discussion in the story. This is Dr. Watson is writing this. Stretching himself upon his face and leaning his chin upon his hands, he being Sherlock, made a careful study of the trampled mud in front of him. "Hello," said he. Suddenly, "What's this?" It was a wax vesta, which is a match. It's just a match head. Half burned, which was so coated with mud that it looked at first like a little chip of wood. The inspector is annoyed. "I cannot think how I came to overlook it," he said with an expression of annoyance. Sherlock's response, his reaction, is everything. It's everything to this episode of the series, and really it's everything to the entire series. Listen to what Holmes says. It was invisible, buried in the mud. I only saw it because I was looking for it. The inspector says, what? You expected to find it? And Holmes said, I thought it not unlikely. Sherlock Holmes, in this instance, has a working hypothesis for what happened at this site. He already has in his mind an idea of how to explain everything that happened, the missing racehorse and the death of his trainer. And he knows that in order for his hypothesis to be tested, in order for it to be borne out, in order for it to be supported, he knows exactly what he needs to find. That's archaeology. If you tell me ancient Celts lived in New Hampshire and sacrificed people and collected their blood, cool story, cool hypothesis. I know what we need to find in order to support that hypothesis. If you tell me there was a lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and its sailors spread all around the world and gave people in various places technological skills, agricultural skills, mathematical skills, astronomical skills, cool story, cool hypothesis. As an archaeologist with more than 40 years experience, I know what we must find in order to support that hypothesis. And if we don't find it, we walk away saying, well, that's a cool speculation, but there's nothing to support that hypothesis. If you tell me the mounds of the American Midwest were built by wandering Jews or Phoenicians or Romans or Egyptians or the Aztecs, cool stories, cool hypotheses. But as an archaeologist, I know what we've got to find when we excavate in those mounds, when we excavate in those communities around those mounds, if those hypotheses are to be supported. And if that's not what we find, if we find, in fact, contrary evidence, then we ditch the hypothesis. We walk away from it. This series is going to be all about the actual data that actual archaeologists find in attempting to answer questions, in attempting to test those kinds of hypotheses. That's what Sherlock Holmes did. That's what archaeologists do. After accumulating a vast storehouse of experience with criminality, Holmes knows what he's supposed to find. Sherlock Holmes has the experience, has the training to know what to find and how to find it. Archaeology is the same way. Now, the definition I would always give my class, what's archaeology? Archaeology is the study of the material remains of human behavior. And then when I'd ask students, is there anything that you would have expected I would have included in that definition that's not there? And usually students will just sit on their hands and they're not going to answer the question. But usually there's, somebody in the front row. Those annoying people are always raising their hand. Well, somebody in the front row will raise their hand and say, well, you didn't say it had to be old. I said, yeah, it's true. Archaeology is not about ancient stuff. It includes ancient stuff, but I'm going to be talking about a site towards the end of the series that's barely 100 years old. But it's a cool archaeological site. I'm going to be talking about a site, a folly actually, that was like about 2 weeks old when I looked at it and when it was investigated. We'll put those in scare quotes. So it doesn't have to be old. It doesn't have to be before the Bible. It doesn't have to be before writing. We do archaeology among folks who had writing systems. What it focuses on, material remains. And again, that's why that analogy, that metaphor of archaeologists are like detectives works so well, because it does focus on material stuff, on artifacts, on the things that people made and used and left behind. They made, used, they lost it, they threw it away, they discarded it, they put it away for safekeeping and never returned, they abandoned it. All of that stuff, that's the database. That's the source of archaeological knowledge. And we know how we are practiced at recovering that stuff and practiced at analyzing it. And lucky for us, people are not neat freaks. And that's something that's really important. That everywhere people go, everywhere they live, everywhere they quarry stone, everywhere they hunt, everywhere they gather food, everywhere they farm, people tend to be pretty sloppy. people are slobs, and they leave behind a mess. And that mess is what constitutes the archaeological record. A lot of folks think archaeology is about looking at fantastic monuments or impressive burials or looking at writing, graffiti. Yeah, archaeology includes that. 99% of what archaeologists do is they rummage through people's trash. If people from thousands of years ago could see the kinds of things that get archaeologists excited, they would walk away and think those people are deranged. That's just garbage, it's trash. But there's so much information in that trash. That's the focus of archaeology. Archaeology is sometimes defined as the study of other people's garbage, and there's a lot of truth to that. Now, in the manner of Sherlock Holmes, we study stuff that people lost or discarded or just fell by the wayside. And what we know is that the stuff, and this is an important theme that you'll hear again and again and again in the series, what's important is everybody's stuff is different. Everybody's stuff is unique. And that people leave a distinctive footprint, a cultural footprint. And archaeologists are good at recognizing those cultural footprints. And variables like the raw materials that people use to make their stuff, how they made their stuff, their technology, how they fancied their stuff up, their styles, even the cultural rules about how they dispose of their trash. Every group of people does it their own unique way, and archaeologists get really good and really practiced at recognizing and distinguishing people's trash from other people's trash. And why? Tradition. You know the Broadway show Fiddler on the Roof? Tevye, the patriarch. At one point, these are Jews in Eastern Europe, the 19th century. And his people, his folks, do things a particular way. And Tevye, in the song Tradition, he kind of talks to himself and says, Tevye, why do we do things in this particular way? And Tevye answers, I don't know. But it's tradition. And the song is all about how a group of people define themselves, distinguish themselves from other people by doing things in a traditional way, in a way their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did it, and they pass it along to their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and so on. And yeah, sure, innovative behaviors come into the picture, and people sometimes go against tradition, but by and large, groups of people do things the way they've always done it, and they incorporate new things into those existing traditions. And so because of that, archaeologists recognize those different traditions in the material record. Those traditions become incorporated into the things that people make and use because they are making and using those things in ways that tradition dictates. Not always. Of course, things evolve over time, but we can track that evolution as well. So if you're telling me, again, that Druids were in New Hampshire, cool story, cool hypothesis. But we know what the material culture of Druids is because there are Druids in Europe. Where is the evidence for that? We know what physical evidence there is in the Middle East, Jews 2,000 years ago. Well, do we find those things in New Mexico where you're telling me, well, there's the Ten Commandments are etched onto a big stone there. Okay, again, cool story, cool hypothesis, but we know how to track those folks. Is there evidence for that? And we'll be looking at that again and again and again in the series. Tradition. What I'm showing you here is just a small sampling of weapons, tools, spear points, arrowheads. Every one of them reflects the tradition of a different culture from a different time period. Some of those are stone, some of them are metal, and one of them is bone, that long, whitish one and sort of to the left of middle there. But each one of those represents, it's not some random thing. That upper left, that is a spear point that my crew found. It's 5,000 years old based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal at the site in Avon, Connecticut. And we found all of the tools that were spear points or knives or drills had that same kind of base, kind of fishtail-y base. The really tall, beautiful point at stone point to the right that takes the full extent of the page, that kind of brownish one, That's a Clovis point. Those are found all over the United States from a very limited time period, about 13,500 to maybe 11,000 years ago, maybe even a narrower range than that. And those are associated with extinct elephants, mammoths and mastodons. And we recognize that. It doesn't say that on the point, but we've dug enough of these sites. We've dated enough of these sites that when you find another one of these tools, you know what it is and where it dates to. So every one of those, the metal ones, the one on the upper right is just a modern steel arrow, but to the left of it is a copper spear point. To two over there, there's another brass one. So again, the raw materials used, the shape, the form, the size, all of those reflect a particular culture from a particular time. So again, if you're telling me those people were here in North America, I'm looking for that kind of precise evidence. Where Holmes is looking for a wax vesta, we look for specific kinds of spear points. Or ceramics. This is another example of how different people make things differently, and it identifies who they were. The one in the upper left, that is typical British transfer print whiteware made in the probably early 19th century we're looking at there. Below that, now we find stuff like that, pieces of it, here in New England because the people, spoiler alert, it's called New England because people moved here from, England. And so the fact that there are English artifacts here in New England makes perfect sense from an archaeological perspective. It's what we'd expect. If we had no written record, we would trace those artifacts back to England because that's where those things came from. Now, that one on the bottom left, that's not even ceramic. It's not clay. It's stone. It's a stone called soapstone, in fact. A soft rock found here in New England, very valuable, very useful for making vessels. Before pottery, before ceramic technology came into this area around 3,000 years ago. Now, if you look to the right of that, isn't that cool? That black on white bowl with the bat on it. That's from New Mexico. It's called Mimbres. It's an area in New Mexico where a couple thousand years ago people were making these beautiful bowls. There's no glaze on those. Those are not made on a wheel. You can see that when you look closely at that, which is very different from the one in the upper left, which is glazed, wheel-made pottery, wheel-made ceramics. And then if you look, I love the one all the way on the right. That's from South America. That's a stirrup vessel. With that really cool design on it. And to the left of it is a cup, a mug made of redware, again, with glaze on it. The point I'm making here is that, again, each of these represents a different time period, a different culture from a different part of the world. And we become experts, archaeologists do, at recognizing those technologies, recognizing the differences, and being able, therefore, to trace the movement of people by the movement of their artifacts, because people are bringing that stuff with them, whether it's spear points or pots or housing. Here's another slide showing a vast array of different kinds of structures in which people lived. And you have the upper left is a Native American teepees, and then we have to the right of that is a wigwam from this area. It's a reconstruction. We have cliff dwellings. That's Montezuma Castle in Arizona. Different groups of people make different kinds of houses, and we have the one on the far right is the oldest house that still exists here in Connecticut. And so again, that's a British pattern. And there's a yurt on the lower left, and an earth lodge, the middle bottom. And then there's a house, a modern house built of a Japanese style. You recognize, it's like, folks, it's like looking at cars and recognizing different cars have different styles from different time periods. And if a 1950s car drove by outside your house, you would know that's not a modern car. That's not what cars look like today. Because we are familiar with that technology, well, archaeologists become familiar with every technology. And they're able, therefore, to identify and trace people as they move across the landscape. So that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. We're not just looking for monuments. We're not just looking for written messages. We're looking for the actual stuff that people bring with them wherever they go when we try to trace the movement of people. Whether it's folks from Egypt, or folks from the Middle East, or folks from Great Britain, or folks from China, or folks from Atlantis, or folks from outer space. Everybody leaves a trail. Everybody leaves a trail of footprints. The whole point of this is that archaeologists become very good at identifying and distinguishing those different footprints. again, because of tradition. So you'll see in a series of these lectures, you'll see claims that there are stone chambers built by ancient Celts throughout New England. You'll see that there's claims that the Atlanteans taught folks how to make pyramids or to conduct agriculture. You'll see claims that ancient aliens landed on Earth and gave people technology. Again and again and again, I say it over and over again. Well, those are cool ideas, cool speculations, cool hypotheses, but they have to stand up to rigorous testing. And the rigorous testing of archaeology is all about stuff, all about material culture. Yeah, I mean, this is just, again, why I like returning to Sherlock Holmes. Just as he became expert at tracking footprints, actual footprints of people and of a gigantic, luminous, paranormal hound and Hound of the Baskervilles, archaeologists get really good at recognizing these metaphorical footprints of different cultures, of different groups of folks. Here's an example. I don't want you to think that archaeologists are cynical or they are, naysayers or gainsayers or deniers. We recognize when people move through an area and leave behind the kinds of evidence that we expect, the wax vestas that Sherlock Holmes was looking for. And that example, the best example, is the Norse. Those two books, Eric the Red Saga and the Greenlander Saga, were written probably in around 800 years ago or thereabouts, and they refer to things that happened 200 years before. And the story is pretty cool. They tell a very similar story. This guy, Bjarni Herjolfsson, he's a Norseman, he's a Viking. He leaves Scandinavia looking for his dad. He wants to find his dad, move in with his dad, who has already moved to Iceland. The Norse had inhabited Iceland. And when he gets there, this is about the year 985, 990, 1000, something like that. He gets to Iceland, they say, oh, your dad, he left. Yeah, he moved to a new land. There's a new land to the west. We call it Greenland. And the joke there is that Greenland wasn't very green. It was really white because it had so much ice and snow. But they wanted to encourage settlement. So it's one of the early examples of fake advertising in real estate. They literally said, yeah, we'll call it Greenland. Yeah, that'll get people here. And whatever. So Bjarni said, okay, I'll go look for Greenland in his boat. He missed Greenland. He lost it. How do you miss Greenland? I'm not exactly sure, but he sailed south of it. And he continued sailing south. These are what the sagas say, and saw new lands to the west. Now, he didn't make landfall. The guy's not an explorer. He's a farmer. Turns around, heads back east and kind of north, finds Greenland, and ultimately finds the Norse who are living in Greenland. He tells them, have you ever sailed west? Because there's more land out there, and it's pretty cool. And they go, no, I didn't know that. Would you take us there? And he said, oh, no, dudes, I'm a farmer. I'm done exploring. One of the people who hears about this is this guy, Eric the Red, who you probably have heard of, who was pretty badass. He got kicked out of Scandinavia for killing a guy. Then he got kicked out of Iceland for killing a guy. That's why he's living in Greenland. He's a little older at this point, and he says, no, I'm done exploring. But his son, Leif Erikson, that's how they named each other. How they named their kids. He liked the idea of exploring to the west. He asked if, Bjarni said, look, I'm not going anywhere. So Leif bought Bjarni's boat because he thought the boat would remember the way. And that's the whole story of the Norse sailing west, finding three lands, Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. And ultimately, over the next 100 years or so, they talk about actually settling in this new land, and eventually they gave up because the weather turned bad. And the local people, they talk about local people, Skraelings, who turned out to be Native Americans, the Skraelings kind of kicked them out. Now, the deal is, that's a great story. People have known about that for a long time, but where's the evidence? And it took a long time for people to find the wax vestas of the Norse, the art, the stuff, the garbage left by the Norse. Because if they're settled here, they're here for any length of time, we're going to find their stuff. Stuff that they lost, stuff they threw away, stuff that they made, stuff that they abandoned, stuff that they put away for safekeeping. And sure enough, in the 1960s, an archaeologist, Anne Stein Ingstad, helped by her husband Helg, actually found a site on a promontory, a peninsula, up in northwestern Newfoundland, a land called Newfoundland, and was able to identify the stuff that was there as absolutely Norse. The site is called L'Anse Meadows, and this is a Norse site dating to 1,000 years ago, accepted by archaeologists Absolutely. Even those people who are skeptical about the sagas, are they really true? Do they actually describe North America? The archaeological evidence, the physical evidence shows it absolutely. And these are the remains of what are Viking houses. There's a reconstruction of L'Anse aux Meadows. It's like a state national park now in Canada. There's an iron smithy. Again, these are the kinds of things that local native people weren't doing. They did not have iron tools other than meteoric iron, or iron made produced that they collected from meteors. This certainly was not a typical smithy from the historical period of just a couple hundred years ago. This was a typical place for making iron, for smelting iron, that you find in Iceland, you find in Greenland, you find back in Scandinavia. The archaeological evidence is absolutely convincing. There's 800 artifacts. We're going to talk about this very approach to the claim that there were ancient Celts living in New Hampshire 2,000 years ago. It's an easy thing to approach. Do the archaeology. What does the archaeological evidence show? In the case of the Ingstadt's archaeological excavations, they found 800 artifacts that were absolutely Norse. They weren't native, they weren't more recent than that. So there's a soapstone spindle whorl for spinning wool. There's a ring-headed bronze pin, really beautiful artifact. That again, that's Norse. And it's in a context that's 1,000 years old. That's the kind of evidence that archaeologists are going to expect. Just like Sherlock Holmes expected that match because he knew something had to have been illuminated at that site where the traitor died. In that same way, we know what has to be at that site in order for us to support the claim, the hypothesis that it's Norse. And it's the same thing for Atlanteans in Australia, or the Druids in New Hampshire, or Jews in New Mexico, or whoever in the American Midwest building those mounds. We know what to look for. We know what must be found. And if it's not found, then we say, okay, it's a cool speculation, put it on a shelf, leave it there until any supporting evidence is forthcoming. Now, you know how I said sometimes people call me mean. I'm going to get a little mean here and talk about what happens when people, all that stuff I talked about, they ignore that or don't know that because they don't have any background in archaeology and they just kind of speculate. What happens? What do we archaeologists call it? Sometimes we call it kind of nasty things. Some archaeologists are nasty. Not me, I'm a sweetheart. Pseudoarchaeology, you'll see that. You'll see archaeologists all the time using that. That may be the most popular name given to kind of fake archaeology that doesn't follow standard protocol for answering questions about the human past. So there's the pseudoscientific archaeology, pseudoarchaeology. Some people like that, some people don't. That's probably the most common. How about this one? Fringe archaeology, archaeology at the fringe. That's actually nicer because, sometimes the center moves on a topic, and so the fringe no longer is at the fringe, it kind of moves more to the center, or actually the center moves more towards it. So people who are saying things that, generally speaking, archaeologists say, no, we don't think there's enough evidence for that, no, we're not so sure about that. So it's a kind of a kinder way of calling, name for it. Alternative archaeology, there's another one, where there's an old expression, what do you call alternative medicine that works? You call it medicine. So what do you call alternative archaeology that actually works? You call it archaeology. So I don't know what it's an alternative to. That's kind of a tough one. This next one, I don't think has ever gained a whole lot of traction, and I know why. Fantastic archaeology. Now, it's fantastic in the sense that it's a fantasy. There's a great book by Stephen Williams, archaeologist, called Fantastic Archaeology, but what it focuses on is what he calls fantasies about the human past. I was on a podcast for a couple of years produced by Sarah Head, who was an archaeology grad student, Jeb Card, a fine archaeologist, great guy, real smart guy. Jeb calls himself a weird shitologist, and that's very accurate. Well, we were part of that podcast for a while. It was called Archaeological Fantasies. That's what we're talking about here. I don't like the Fantastic Archaeology name because, for me, fantastic archaeology. Well, yeah, archaeology is fantastic. I love archaeology. So it's kind of misleading. So listen, if you're a sensitive soul, put your fingers in your ears, Avert your eyes. You don't want to see this. But this was actually the term used by an archaeologist, Glyn Daniel, who was a big deal archaeologist in the UK, a proper British archaeologist, brilliant guy, did amazing archaeology in both a speech but also in print. He called this kind of fake archaeology, he called it bullshit archaeology, which, well, if I like that one a lot. It's kind of nasty. It is a little bit mean, maybe, but it does reflect how a lot of archaeologists view pseudo, alternative, fringe, fantastic archaeology. But we don't like to say it out loud because it gets people mad at us. So I will interchangeably use any of those words, usually rely on pseudoarchaeology, because what folks are doing who basically are sitting in a chair and thinking, I wonder if there was a lost civilization. I wonder if ancient aliens came to Earth and taught people how to build pyramids and all. That's pseudoarchaeology. That's speculation. It's not real archaeology. And enough there. One of the headlines, I'm going to be bouncing around a lot, just talking about kind of venting. This is my archaeological venting. You will sometimes see headlines that read something like this. This is an exaggeration. Mystified archaeologists are baffled by mysterious discovery. Very mysterious. It's very baffling. We're walking around with our heads, like chickens with their heads cut off. Remember that meme of Kevin from Home Alone where he's like holding his head and screaming? The idea here is that somebody comes up with some new find and archaeologists are like Kevin in Home Alone. No, we're not. That's ridiculous. Here's the deal. Here's what I'm going to translate that headline. Fascinated archaeologists are intrigued by an unexpected discovery and are conducting additional research to understand it better. That's what archaeologists do. It's a science. We're always looking for new interpretations, new evidence, new technologies, new ways of viewing things, new paradigms, new hypotheses. We're always looking for that. That's what makes it exciting. If everything was written in stone, which I know is a terrible phrase for an archaeologist to use, if everything was written in stone, it would be boring. We look forward to these things. We're not baffled. We're not flummoxed. We're not upset. We're not crying about it. We are intrigued by it. But being intrigued is not enough. Being interesting is not enough. We want it tested. It's always from the perspective of, okay, prove it. And if you can, that's great. And if you can't, take a seat. Here's an example of a mystery, and it's ridiculous. The mystery of the darkened soil. So we're excavating in Avon, Connecticut at the confluence of a little stream and the Farmington River. And as we are scraping by the soil, we don't know what's there yet. We always start from the perspective of ignorance. Okay, we don't know what's here, and we reveal what happened. We reveal what these folks did at this site. So we notice that the soil is mottled. It's dark. That's mysterious. Why is that? All the other soil all around it where we were scraping, just tan, just brown. It's a silt. It's a loam. There are no rocks in it. There's no darkening. But right here, it got dark. Now, we did not stop the presses. We're baffled by this. No, we were intrigued by it. So we scraped around some more. And it turns out that under that dark stain, there were stones. Now, I'm telling you, this is good agricultural soil. There's no other stones. It's real nice silt, alluvium, right? It's a real fine soil. And there's not a single rock anywhere around it. But here, there's a whole bunch of rocks. And all of the rocks looked burned. They had been in a fire. So we began expanding that and found more and more rocks. But again, in what was a rectangle about 4 feet by 5 feet, in and among those rocks, it was clear it was charcoal. So it was burning. Somebody had burned wood right there, and there were little white flecks, and the little white flecks were calcined bone. Burned bone. Too small to identify the species, but it was burned bone. And by the time we were done excavating that area, you notice, got all that clean soil all around it, and there's that rectangle of stones. And we know what that is. It's a roasting platform. We see these throughout the archaeological record here in New England. We know it's a roasting platform because we have the burning to show that there was a fire there. And in some cases, the bones are big enough you can actually identify the species. Often it's deer. So what starts off as a mystery with just a little bit of modeling of soil, we reveal it as an a feature that turns out to be about 4,000 years old. Now, one more thing. You see in the kind of a little bit above and to the right of center, that little scale, that ruler, that is 15 centimeters. So say, 7 inches or thereabouts. And you'll notice that there's something right under the ruler, right where that arrow is pointing to. Well, here's what that is. It's a spear point. And it's a spear point that is almost complete, but the tip has broken off. Now, I'm going to speculate here that one of the animals killed, butchered, and cooked on that roasting platform, that there's the smoking gun right there. That when it entered the animal's body, it hit a bone. The animal ran away, bled out. They followed him. They pulled that spear out, brought everything back to their little encampment. They took the stone spear off of the wooden shaft. Wooden shaft is fine. They threw that on the ground, maybe expecting that they could rework it into another, maybe a little bit smaller point. It got stepped on, it got covered up, and it remained there for 4,250 years till archaeologists recovered it. Now, I can't prove that absolutely. I am speculating. I admit that. But it is sort of a plausible story for why that spear is right adjacent to, at the same level of the roasting platform, right adjacent to it, and the tip is broken off. So what starts as a mystery ends up with a really interesting scenario where at least we know, people hunted animals and they cooked them on this roasting platform, and we maybe even have the weapon used to kill the animal. That, in microcosm, is what archaeologists do all the time. But now, for something completely different, complaints and accusations. So everything I've talked about so far, archaeologists say, oh yeah, that's how we do our work. But for some people, archaeologists are closed-minded and we don't listen to new things. What I'm telling you here is, and for every one of the episodes of this series, it's not that we're closed-minded, we just are demanding of proof. We're demanding of evidence that is convincing. But some people don't like that. So, complaints and accusations. Archaeologists hate me. I'm not making that up. You can find any one of a number of pseudo, fringe, alternative, fantastic bullshit archaeologists. We'll use it as a compound modifier there. They complain bitterly that we just don't like them, that we hate them. Because this is my series. It's all about me. And this is why I don't need therapy, folks. I get to vent, whether it's in front of a classroom or in a book or here in a YouTube series. So I had a friend. This young woman had taken my archaeology field school. She was a student at another university, but she lived locally. Took my field school, and we remained in touch for years afterwards. She died recently, but I knew her for years. And she was brilliant, but had no institutional affiliation. She was an author. She published her own stuff, and most historians would look at her stuff and say, she's fringe. She can't prove anything. And I understand that. I didn't hate her. She didn't hate me. We got along. We talked every once in a while. But because she was kind of on the fringes of history, she also encountered people who are on the fringes of archaeology. And went to conferences where there were people who I would call pseudo-archaeologists. She called me up one day and said, Kenny, you're not going to believe this. This is really funny. I said, what's up? So she was at one of these conferences and she ran into a gentleman who was called himself an archaeologist, but had no training, no background, no formal training anyway. So she's talking to him and she said, she told him, this is what she tells me, that she says, Kenny, I told him that I was, had taken archaeology and I knew what I was talking about. And then in fact, she said to me, I told him I had been one of your students. I was in your field school. And what she said to me was, his eyes widened, he got all puffed up, and he said, Kenny Fader hates me and thinks I'm his worst enemy. Now, what a weird flex, right? Somebody who thinks they're a big shot because I hate them? I'm no big deal. No, if that is how you define yourself, if that's how you puff yourself up, oh my gosh, get a life. But here's the saddest part, absolutely the saddest part. I had never heard of the guy. Until that moment, this person who believed that I hated him and he was my worst enemy, I had never even heard of him. I bet you he would have been really disappointed to know that, no, you're not even important enough for me to hate. That's kind of absurd. That's a weird thing to think. I hate Nazis. Other than that, I don't hate anybody. I don't hate people simply because they're wrong, which leads me to Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I'm contradicted. So yeah, you know what? We don't try to cancel anybody. We don't try to ruin anybody's career. We just want to tell you you're wrong when we think you're wrong. And if you think you're right, go for it. Keep pushing, and maybe someday you'll be able to prove you're right. But right now, archaeologists think you're dead wrong. So no, we don't really hate anybody. Archaeologists resist new evidence. You're closed-minded. You know what? I'm going to admit that there's some truth to that. Because archaeologists are skeptics. We're skeptical. That doesn't mean we are cynical. We don't deny, we doubt. If you tell me you archaeologists have it wrong, here's the way things really were, yes, we resist that. But we don't put our hands over our ears and go, la, 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 we're not going to listen to you. We don't walk away. We don't, you know what we do? We look at the evidence you present. And I'm sorry, if the evidence isn't there, then we close our minds to you. Because until and unless you give us affirmative evidence that there was a lost civilization, that there were ancient aliens landing on Earth and teaching Egyptians how to build pyramids, that there were bloodthirsty Celts in New Hampshire, until you give me the evidence instead of a just so story, yeah, we're going to gainsay that. We're going to negate that. We're going to deny that. But only until you come up with evidence that proves us wrong. So yep, we're skeptics, not cynics, doubters, not deniers. Archaeologists hide the truth. This is the funny one. I've actually been accused on multiple occasions of knowing the truth about ancient astronauts or Atlantis or lost civilizations or whatever. And that archaeologists are part of a cabal, a conspiracy, big archaeology. We're sitting around, we meet on like alternate Thursdays in a church basement. I think this week it's my turn to bring the dip. I can't remember. I'll have to check my secret emails. And we get together and we figure out ways to keep you people in the dark. Actual email to me. I do believe that you somehow are part of a plan to keep us in the dark. I don't claim to fully understand, but you, sir, are full of shit. So the people who bitch about archaeologists being mean and nasty, you should see my emails. Oh my gosh, grow up. It's a tough world out there. If you don't like the heat, get out of the kitchen and all that. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But you should see. I've had people email my dean asking to get me fired because I didn't believe in Atlantis. So, let's not even go there. So, by the way, this guy, at the end of his email, he says, by the way, Fader, if you're going to respond, you should be aware of the fact that this is my mother's email account. Like, no, really? Dude, your mom? So I shouldn't say bad words because maybe your mom will be upset? For years, I told my students, what is like, so some 12-year-old is bad talking me? And then my students have always said, 12, he's 40, he's living in his mom's basement and using her email account. Well, okay, I guess. Look, we're not trying to hide. Why would we hide anything? I tell you what, really cool stuff would get me, if I made some claim, some outrageous claim and could back it up, I would get funding. I would get national attention. I would get a book deal, a serious book deal with serious money. There's no way. Archaeologists talk too much. They schmooze too much. They brag too much. Some of them drink too much to keep anything quiet. So if we knew stuff, you'd be hearing about it from archaeologists. So no, we don't hide the truth. Oh, I hate this one. Well, Fader, why are you getting mad at me? I'm only asking questions. I call bullshit on that. Nobody ever only asks questions, right? If you're writing and you ask a question and then you go about the task of trying to answer the question, that's one thing. But if you say, well, I'm only asking questions, nope, that doesn't happen. People are planting seeds. When I talk about ancient astronauts, we're going to see Eric von Däniken asks a bunch of questions. And some of these questions are loaded with, they're dripping with racism. When Eric von Däniken says, oh, I'm only asking a question. And my question is, was the black race a mistake? And did the aliens try to fix it through genetic manipulation? That's not a question, dude. That is planting a racist seed in the minds of people, putting them in the idea, giving them the idea that, yeah, gee, maybe that's what it is. Ian Betteridge is a journalist in the UK, and there's his maxim. He has a maxim about headlines that end in a question mark. So it's specifically about that. I think it applies to claims made in archaeology. And here's what he says. Any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. The reason why journalists use that style of headline is that they know the story is probably bullshit and don't actually have the sources and facts to back it up, but they still want to run it. So they want people to read that. And they know it's not true. But if you put a question mark, you can never be called on it. You can never see people say, are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm only asking questions. You know, in a court of law, if somebody is in front of, is being cross-examined, and the prosecutor says, so, the person's on trial for embezzlement. And if the prosecutor says, so, do you beat your children? Whoa, dude, where'd that come from? And again, the judge would say that's completely out of order. You haven't backed that up with any fact. You're just trying to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury, and that's illegal. You can't do that. It's the same thing here. Isn't it at least possible? So, okay, maybe there's no evidence for ancient aliens, but is it at least possible? Maybe there's no evidence for a great lost civilization. Maybe I don't have that. Don't have that evidence. But isn't it at least possible? I am now going to share with you, remember that part before I said I wasn't mean? All right, maybe sometimes I am. I was interviewed for a documentary. The answer to the question, is it possible, is almost always yes, but that's trivial, and I'll explain why. So I highly recommend going on YouTube and watch the video, The Dragons of Jim Green. Jim Green in this picture is the bearded guy in the middle. He's an old guy, lived in South Carolina. He has passed away since the video was made. Lived in South Carolina, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that he had on his property evidence of a 30 million year old civilization of intelligent reptiles. Reptiles who built spaceships and boats and had a city with banks. He had a model of the city that he said was on his property, and there was a house of prostitution. How does Jim Green know any of this stuff? He dug holes and found a lot of rocks. Now, it's a very well-made documentary. The dude with the little soul patch there and the hair to Jim Green's right, to the left of the slide, his name is Randy Sallow. I got to meet Randy. Great guy, brilliant filmmaker. And here's the poignant part. Randy Sallow was Jim Green's grandson. So he practically grew up on the old guy's farm, heard the stories of the reptilian civilization from 30 million years ago, and Randy loved his grandfather. And I didn't meet his grandfather, I met Randy. The grandfather seemed like a really sweet guy, really interesting fellow, really well-meaning, just wrong, right? We don't hate him, we just say, no, there's no evidence for that. But Randy, a smart guy. He knew there were problems with his grandfather's explanations about what he was finding, but he wanted so much for it to have some truth to it, that his grandfather had really discovered something major and important. So Randy came to my house and interviewed me, and Randy asked me that question. So here, I wrote this transcript. These are the actual words. If you're saying to me after you hear this, oh, Fader, no, you didn't. Yeah, I did. Go watch the video. Randy asked me, is it possible that civilizations could have existed 35 million years ago? And here's exactly how I answered. I wasn't intending to be mean. I don't like your question. I don't like your question because no matter what I say, I'm screwed, right? If I say no, categorically no, I'm just a hard-ass skeptic and I have a closed mind. If I say, well, yeah, it's possible, and you just cut it there and don't allow me to say, it's possible because, yeah, anything's possible because right now a pig could fly out of my asshole. Yeah, I said that. The point I was making is, yeah, sure, you can't say anything categorically, absolutely, 100% certainty. No, it didn't happen, or it can't happen. It can't have happened. But the likelihood of a 35 million year old civilization of reptiles living in South Carolina, about as likely as, swine and, exiting my posterior. And if you think that's probably pretty unlikely, and I assure you it's pretty unlikely, I only eat bacon occasionally, then you know what I'm saying. So again, is it possible? And that's a meaningless question. All right. Now this bothers me, especially as a textbook author. You scientists are going to need to rewrite the textbooks because of my discovery. And it's usually in all caps with like an inappropriate number of exclamation points. I am sorry, folks. That's not a gotcha. Rewriting textbooks, that's what scientists do all the time. That's our job, to rewrite the books, because we're always looking for new evidence, new information. It's got to be convincing, though. I'll give you my examples, because again, this is all about me. This is my therapy. That book I showed you at the beginning, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience and Archaeology. I wrote it in 1990. That's a long time ago, right? It's more than 34 years ago. It's now in its 10th edition. It's going into its 11th edition. You know what that means? That means that since 1990, I have rewritten that textbook 10 times. Why? Because I'm closed-minded? Because I'm not open to new information? Hell no, it's because, hey, that's new information. Hey, that's a new way of looking at it. That's new data. We have to reevaluate. We have to reassess. I don't want anybody reading the wrong stuff. So, verily, as we sit, when we're done taping this, I will be going back to look at edited copy of the 10th edition that's going to be going into the 11th edition. An even better example, I think, is another one of my books, The Past and Perspective, An Introduction to Human Prehistory. It was originally published in 1996. Since 96, all kinds of new methods, new techniques, new sites, new discoveries that have caused us to reevaluate much of what we thought we knew in 1996 of the human past. The book is going, verily as we sit here, I'm waiting for my comp copies of the 9th edition. So I've rewritten it 8 times. Now, what that means is archaeologists are open to new data. We embrace new data when the evidence is supportive of the new claims. We incorporate that into our publications, into our thinking, into our papers, into our books. And no, it doesn't mean, well then, anything is possible. No, anything is possible. If you think that, you haven't learned the lesson of my pig story. Learn the lesson of my pig story. Anything is possible, but listen, don't bet on it. All right, so that's kind of my rant, with one final slide. When I was in college, I loved the comedy group, improv comedy group, Fireside Theater. Hilarious and weird and really trippy. And I want to end this should be the first episode that you're watching, not the first that we've recorded, but the first that you're watching, I hope, with one of their catchphrases. All right. So, in our journey to a selection of fascinating frauds, myths, and mysteries in archaeology, let's proceed forward into the past. Thanks for listening, and let's look at some interesting frauds, myths, and mysteries in the coming episodes.